I was thinking about how to make an informative video on gauging character strength, but I'll be honest, that sounded a bit too hard. So we'll be doing the reverse instead. Today, I'll be rambling about Ewiyar and why context matters. I apologize for the backwards script in advance. First, following our theme of doing things backwards, let's jump to the second half of that title and our conclusion. When I say context matters, what I mean is the fights and the other characters in the team are just as important as a character's individual strengths. Let's start with fights. Some fights have low health and need to be cleared repeatedly, making the ideal character for them being one that is effective with minimal skills used. In content such as this, a character like Bowman who literally cannot click any skills and does everything in his kit by clicking the orange button is amazing. The complete opposite side of the spectrum is the endgame character who exists to clear omens and keep the team alive. The requirements of what makes a character good depends on the boss's mechanics, and omens with the additional need for the character to not get blown up by a gentle breeze. This is where you typically see your characters like Cosmos or Charlotta who have a lot in their kit that is gated by a ramp-up period alongside additional utility units to keep them alive. Then you have the middle ground for content such as fast setups for Revens or full auto setups for Magna 3. Usually the best setup involves staples of the element for quick honor gain, but with room for substitution due to quirks in the fight. A good example of this would be a character like Helmao being a good choice and Luminera Credo Omega as a dispeller thanks to her helping push the conditional chest and taking a chunk out of the boss's 10 buffs. Additionally, team comp also matters. There's the classic idea of synergy, where two characters come together to perform far better than they could individually. Yukata Silva and Wilna's is a great example of this sort of team synergy where Silva perfectly makes up for Wilna's weaknesses while granting him double strike on his triple attack turns, allowing him to deal large amounts of damage. On the other hand, some characters don't work well together at all. The first way this can occur is a lack of synergy, such as using a mix of charge attackers and characters that don't want to charge attack at all. There aren't many comps out there using Grand Narmea and Katura on the same team. The second way this can occur is effect stacking. Some effects in the game don't stack, which can lead to some characters stepping on each other's toes. Mahira and Earth Olivia's supplemental damage support skills don't stack, leaving just like flying useless for Olivia as her support skill is much larger. Although a small interaction like this doesn't stop them from being run together, there are far more detrimental interactions like this which dissuade certain characters from being put on the same team. This leaves enough variety in what's needed for players to use more than one set of characters. Even staples of the elements such as Fedial aren't used everywhere, and characters with not as much juice in their kit can still find uses. Summer Lucio is more than 3 years old, and yet he is still used as the best buffer for Hraesvelgr setups, offering sources of bonus damage and guaranteed triple attacks. But hypothetically, what if a character was stacked but managed to be in an awkward position where their use is still quite limited? Anyway, now that the foreshadowing is over and done with, let's talk about the funny cat. Grand Ewiyar came out in March 2023 and was the long-awaited final elemental wedge. The rest of the 6 dragons shook up every element a fair amount, and it was finally time for Wind to have their turn. So, what did Lord KMR grant us? I'm not going to drag you through an essay on what Ewiyar's kit does because I assume you know what they do already, but I'll just isolate the important parts of Ewiyar's kit into points to make analysis easier for us. Let's start with their consistent team buffs. The large boost to defense and guaranteed double attacks is a great asset to have for hard content, especially when running characters like Charlotta or Katura who don't have any innate multi-attack boosts to work with. Unfortunately for Ewiyar, they have plenty of competition in Wind, primarily coming from Kaguya and Katzelia. Kaguya offers a more survivability-oriented team buff with 100% debuff resistance, 1000 health per turn and 20% reduced damage taken in exchange for only giving herself the multi-attack and echoes. Katzelia on the other hand brings Earth Switch and Bar boosting to the table in exchange for having lower multi-attack and no echoes. What's best comes down to the team comp and content. so we'll put a pin in this for now. Outside of hard content it starts to get dicey. Most damage dealers either bring their own multi-attack or don't require it in the first place, and 100% defense is not particularly valuable in content that you're trying to clear in a low number of turns. This leaves Ewiyar to be mostly useful in long-form content such as full auto setups. Again, this does depend on team comp, as characters such as Narmaya don't benefit from the cat's echo, reducing their contributions to damage. The random buffs that Ewiyar provides are similarly tuned to longer fights, with the cat providing a boost to survivability 2/3 of the time. The supplemental buff doesn't stack with forms of buff supplemental such as Keen, but it's much larger, which means if they are stacking, the cat is the one contributing. The dodge buff is powerful but can be negated in endgame fights by True Sight, although most bosses need to meet some sort of condition to gain this. Dodge does have potential to have synergy with other characters, but Ewiyar's non-limited version is actually much better for this, granting 20% dodge rate boosted at all times from the sub-ally slot alongside a small heal and clear once a turn to characters who dodge. The Revitalize is mostly irrelevant, as Wind has characters far better for consistent healing, such as Katzelia, one of Ewiyar's main competitors. Thanks to it being on a 5-turn delay from using the Emerald's Windfall, the double strike is powerful but extremely awkward to use. The delay means that using the double strike strategically is difficult, needing Ewiyar to deny themselves of their personal buffs to be used later on into a fight. It is also completely useless for burst, although I'm sure that was fairly obvious. This leaves it as either a moderate boon for longer full autos and a small bonus for endgame raids. Ewiyar also doesn't grant the regular buffs on this turn, but there aren't too many situations where I would trade the double strike for any of the other options anyway. Charm immunity is a very flavorful benefit for Ewiyar to have and is required for their buff to function, but is also at the same time a very narrow benefit to have. Enemies with charms are rare to come across, most commonly being seen on guild war bosses, leaving this feature almost useless. Ewiyar can use this to ignore the charm from both Belial summons, but this is mostly just for fun. Standard Belial's effects aren't anything game-changing, while Summer Belial is called mostly for burst, something which Ewiyar isn't particularly great at. Cut to buff durations is unfortunately mostly useless despite having potential. Reducing the amount of time buffs are up is useful, but these buff durations cannot be reduced below 1 turn. A boss with multiple buffs might only need 1 turn to potentially put a hole in your team, requiring some sort of defensive skill to keep the team alive during that time. The alternative is to simply use dispels to remove buffs outright, something Wind is already great at for both full autos and endgame. This leaves buff duration cuts being a worse choice compared to dispels unless the buffs are immune to being dispelled or there are too many buffs to be dispelled. Even then, there's a good chance that Ewiyar and their 100% defense won't be enough to keep you alive on that 1 turn, assuming the cut to buff durations lands on the correct turn. Finally, Ewiyar's Fated Chain passive is a V2 only passive, which limits its use to mostly endgame fights. Having a guaranteed triple attack and echo for the whole party is valuable, but unfortunately for Ewiyar, they're not the only character who has a Fated Chain passive in Wind. Captain Smugman is another Wind character with a Fated Chain passive who is free as long as you're willing to put in the time to grind him out. Although Ewiyar's passive is great for triple attack and hit count omens, Siete has the ability to simply nope the omen out of existence, which is far more powerful. Thankfully, Siete doesn't bring as many tools to the table as Ewiyar, but it is important to remember that building around Siete is also an option. Looking at their kit and the element that surrounds them, Ewiyar is in a position where they're most effective in endgame and more difficult farming content such as Revens and Nightmare 200s. Unfortunately, even their favorite cat is in a role where there is ample competition. In the defense category, they have enough differences that their use comes down to the content. Now, let's look at that content. For Revens, Ewiyar doesn't perform great. Although their presence boosting survivability is greatly appreciated, and Siegfried not having True Sight means that Ewiyar can always make use of their dodge boosts, they contribute almost nothing to omens, only bringing a single blue skill. Additionally, Siegfried also grants himself 3 buffs every failed omen, which either allow him to do brutal amounts of damage or negate any damage your team can deal. These need to be removed as soon as possible for survivability, and the ability to contribute to the fight and reach a blue chest, leaving their buff duration cut basically useless. Now, going into endgame fights, Ewiyar doesn't do much better. In both Hexa and Dark Rapture Zero, Katzelia's Earth Switch immediately gives him the upper hand over the competition. Katzelia additionally provides Charge Bar alongside assisting with debuff omens with his 4th skill. Kaguya's debuff immunity is also very powerful during certain portions of these fights, such as the notorious Luo and Fedial section of Hexa. Meanwhile, Ewiyar's multi-attack is less potent in an element with access to Set D Spade and Kaguya's folding fans to give large amounts of grid data. Additionally, a large number of Wind's endgame regulars are charge attack based, such as Charlotta, Siete and Katura. Katzelia and Kaguya's greater synergy with charge attack based strategies basically leave Ewiyar irrelevant. This leaves Ewiyar with NM 200, which they are actually fairly competent at. Their competition in defense are less valuable thanks to the GW environment. Katzelia is both harder to bring to the front consistently, and their Earth Switch is irrelevant, while Kaguya's ramp-up time stifles her ability to be used. Ewiyar's data can also be more useful for skill-based compositions which might have none of their own innate data and where grid space is more limited. Their random buffs are a nice boon, and the double strike can be used haphazardly, making the 5-turn delay not a big problem. Even charm immunity can be valuable here if the boss fires one off, which becomes the biggest thing Ewiyar can contribute. Now, unfortunately for Ewiyar, this still isn't enough to make them a staple pick. Guild War still requires debuffers, and the buff duration cut still isn't enough for a smooth clear, making other characters in the element a higher priority in comp building. Additionally, Ewiyar lacks synergy with characters used in faster clears such as Vanya and Narmea, who prefer the cap up and dispel cancel effect that Neo provides over effectively useless multi-attack and echoes. This leaves Ewiyar in a position where they serve as a support for primarily slower skill-based comps based on characters such as Lich. Now, of course, this isn't the worst situation a character has been in. If anything, having a niche where they're solid in a game with more than 600 SSRs is pretty good. There are plenty of characters that have been left in the dust or come out mediocre. I just wanted to go through this lengthy rant to show how characters are chosen or not in comps. Now that you wield the power of overanalyzing Grand Blue, I hope you will wield this power responsibly. See through the character who requires 28 button presses to access Tag Team, or the CA character released for an element that just got Echo Exalto. Refuse to pull for characters who don't have any support in their element or characters who aren't functional in any fight at all. Become the world's strongest meta slave. Or you can just pull for their boobs. I'm not your dad, you can do what you want.